Hello and welcome to The Comic Cave. I'm Ramsey, aka Captain Away, and today I'm looking at the 2019 series, Vindication. Vindication is a comic that has clearly come out of the Black Lives Matter movement, focusing on the relationships between poor black people and white cops in LA. The story alternates perspectives between an early 30-something black man that everyone just assumes is a criminal and murderer who belongs in jail, and an early 30-something white cop that everyone assumes is a racist more interested in blaming black people than solving crimes. They each spend all 4 issues of this miniseries trying to prove to themselves, to each other, and to everybody around them that they are more than just the stereotypes they're taken for. I'll be honest, it's a difficult subject to cover and one that could prove a challenge to even the best of writers, so it might be questionable whether first-time comic writer M.D. Marie is the person for the job. But hey, it's good to have someone telling the tough stories, so I'll let you decide if she sinks or swims as we take this away. The comic opens with Turn Washington being released from prison after having served 10 years of a life sentence for a crime that recent DNA evidence has exonerated him from. Right away, there's evidence of some awkward first-time comic writer-itis with the use of some weird talking to oneself moments, like Turn waxing poetic about the sky here. This is something that used to be common in comics, but has mostly been replaced in the modern age by narration boxes. But there isn't a single narration box used in this entire series, which is an interesting and honestly probably good style choice for this comic, but it does lead to these somewhat off-putting moments where Marie needs to explain what a character is thinking and feeling. As Turn exits the prison, he immediately comes across the other main character of this story, Detective Charles "Chip" Christopher. Chip is the cop who put Turn away 10 years ago for the murder of a woman named Gracie Smith Harris. At least, I think it was 10 years ago. Chip also blames Turn for the murder of his partner, which, as we see in a flashback, happened 8 years ago. The 2 cops showed up to a liquor store holdup that was apparently a trap. They were led into a back alley where 2 other men were waiting to shoot them down. Several people tell Chip that none of these men were Turn, who should have been 2 years into his 10-year sentence at this point, but he refuses to believe it. I'm not sure how it would even make sense, but I guess this was maybe supposed to be some kind of revenge killing by the gang Chip believes Turn joined? According to Turn though, he never joined a gang. So back in the present day, Chip and Turn waste no time throwing down their character motivations at each other. Chip thinks Turn is a murderer no matter what the evidence says, and Turn thinks Chip is just another racist, abusive cop. Their argument gets heated and Chip pushes Turn down. Now that's no behavior for a rescue ranger. Chip feels a little bad and tries to help Turn up, but he refuses. The fight ripped off the pocket of Turn's shirt, and Chip ends up walking off with it. This is bad news for Turn, because before long, Chip is investigating a new crime scene with his new partner, Maggie Cruz. They find a woman murdered there and quickly learn that she was one of the jurors at Turn's trial 10 years earlier. Her name is Lacey Turner, and I'm sure you won't have a problem confusing Turn and Turner. Completely different. By this point in the comic, I was already noticing that this series uses a lot of copy-paste for the art. Clearly just taking the art from one panel and moving it into another panel, then just putting down different dialogue. Like here, when a new pair of detectives show up to take over the investigation, the first 2 panels on this page are literally the same panel copied over. Sometimes they'll change one slight detail, like when they first showed up to the scene and talked to this really useless cop. These 3 panels here are all the same, except in the first panel, Cruz has different eye positions, and in the last panel, they added a hand. This could be an intentional style choice. The comic does have broad themes of stagnating of purpose and lack of ability to change, but just a few instances of this would have been enough to get the idea across. This series does it constantly, and it makes it feel like they drew the art they wanted, then used a random panel layout generator and plugged in that art, doubling and tripling, even quadrupling up as needed. Not to rag on this comic too much, but there are other ways of doing this. For example, there's no reason this shot needs to be 2 panels. They could have combined both panels and run all the dialogue across the new, larger panel. There's also this panel from the New 52 Batgirl. Here we see her use her eidetic memory to investigate a scene. This is obviously a bit heavy on the fantasy for a comic as grounded as this one. I'm just saying there's room for some level of style that we don't see expressed here. While investigating the murder scene, Chip accidentally drops the bit of shirt he took from Turn, and Cruz finds it. Since it contains a photograph of Turn and their current victim's phone number, Chip denies all knowledge of it, but still insists on being the one to turn it in to their replacements. When he does, he admits his fingerprints will be on it and asks the other detective to do his best to accidentally overlook that mistake. Which means we're not even a full issue in, and Chip is planting evidence. Whatever his protestations, Chip is clearly not a good cop. When he returns to the station, he's told he's under IA investigation by these two cops here, Detective Jake Connors and Detective Tasha R. Ahmed. Connors is such a bland, nothing character that I just can't seem to remember him. I seriously had to check like 4 or 5 times just to write his name for this review. And every time they would show him in the comic, I would be like, who is that? Oh, that must be Chip. Which led to some seriously confusing moments my first read through. Detective R. Ahmed, whom Chip calls Shake, is Chip's ex-girlfriend. Awkward. As if his life wasn't complicated enough already, Chip gets a phone call from an informant who's left him some surveillance photos of Turn leaving Lacey Turner's house before she was murdered, and a DVD with a video of Turner hiding an SD card. Chip is convinced the SD card holds proof of Turn's involvement in Turner's murder. Unfortunately, nobody seems to be able to find it. Not Chip, who looks through Turner's closet, not Turn, who happens to show up to look for it the same night, and not Lisa Watson, Turn's ex-girlfriend turned private investigator, who he hires to look for the card since Chip seems to be following him everywhere. In the meantime, Turn needs some money and so goes to a poker tournament. Oh wait, what? Bones tournament? What's Bones? Wait, it's Dominoes? This big gambling tournament is a Dominoes tournament? What? Is Dominoes big with young black men in LA right now? Okay. Things get complicated when Turn's younger brother Kenny also shows up to the tournament, but he isn't there to play. Instead, he steals all the gambling money while everyone is busy in different rooms. He wasn't the only party crasher there that night either. Turns out, Chip and 2 other detectives, Scope and Carl, were also there looking for Turn. Kenny spots them in their car, and so they get out to chase him for some reason. I'm not really clear on what the goal was here. He gets knocked out and taken to another location, where Turn and Chip have it out a bit, throwing all their chips on the table. Chip explains why he's so dead set on seeing Turn convicted, and Turn explains that he just wants Chip to realize he's innocent. That innocence doesn't stop him from getting in a few good punches on the cop though. Meanwhile, Scope and Carl pick up Kenny and his friend Ron E. It seems Kenny owed Scope something, which is what he was stealing the money for. We'll learn a little later that this was to pay the men off to cancel a hit they had put out on Turn. But the men have further past Lisa has managed to dig up on Kenny. She confronts him about it, saying whatever his past was with Scope, it was what led to Turn being convicted in the first place. While Turn and Chip were having their bro moment, another murder was going down of another juror from Turn's trial. This time there was a witness, a Carmine Jensen. Jensen was also a juror at Turn's trial, who wrote a book about the murder that got him a small amount of fame. Now he's writing another book, and apparently was writing it with the help of Lacey Turner in this second victim, Mike Jones. Well, that's not suspicious. So Chip and Cruz show up to interview him. He had a typed copy of his eyewitness statement prepared for them. He also has video recording of the murder scene. Topping it all off, he says he actually saw Turn commit the murder with his own eyes. But he also says he was too scared to call the police until he got home. Too scared to call, but not too scared to stay and videotape the murder scene, and also not too scared to type up this whole statement? Yeah, that's not suspicious. It doesn't take a detective to see Carmine is the real criminal here, but he's not the only one. Lisa manages to finally track down the SD card, thanks largely to this kind of absurdly helpful neighbor of Lacey Turner's, and it turns out it was Scope and Carl who actually killed Gracie Harris Smith 10 years earlier, the crime that Turn went away for. Wait a minute, wasn't her name Gracie Smith Harris earlier? Yes it was. The real irony is that it hadn't been Scope and Carl's original intention to frame Turn. Due to some simple and very weak circumstantial evidence, Chip let his own biases lead him to believing Turn was the culprit, and Scope and Carl just decided to help him run with that angle, to the point that the three were eventually able to get the conviction. Chip learns all this while Scope and Carl are visiting, and they decide to take the money they took from Kenny to bribe Chip into silence, also threatening him that if they go down, he'll be too tightly linked with them to not go down as well. As all this was happening, Cruz brings in Carmine Jensen. It seems she found the evidence Jensen had sent to Chip, the photo and the DVD, which she had been keeping a secret. Now tied to too many crimes, Chip turns himself in to Jake and Shake, confessing the whole story and finally admitting to everyone and himself how his own biases and inherent racism led him to convicting an innocent man, while the real criminals went free and became really dirty cops. The comic ends with Turn and Lisa stealing the bribe money back from Chip to pay Kenny's debt back to the people he stole the money from, leaving everything pretty well tied up. So let's cut the cord and get to the breakdown. This story is complicated, and maybe a little needlessly so. I think MD Marie really wanted to cover as many bases as she could while still leaving room for an actual mystery. But the writing isn't exactly top-notch. There's several instances of awkward talking out loud to oneself that feels very out of place, and some weird exchanges like this one, where Chip goes, "Oh, that semi-famous actress that was murdered?" And Cruz replies, "She did that blockbuster action movie," prompting Chip to say, "Critics didn't like it." It's not that weird, and it gets its point across, but it feels awkward to me, and who says blockbuster anymore? Blockbuster action movie? Really? The art is in about the same place. It isn't bad most of the time, but I do feel like the sheer amount of copy and paste used is a little off-putting. Oddly enough, I feel like this only increased as the series went on, whereas Marie's writing definitely seemed to improve later in the story. I think if this had been an ongoing instead of a single series, probably involving a revolving group of characters and stories, we might have seen it eventually hit its stride. But instead, I'll be giving this series a recommendation level of medium. It's not bad, but it's got a ways to go to be great. Still, it's hard to hate a comic that's at least trying to be smart and culturally aware, especially one that manages to do it without making a mess of itself or coming off overly preachy. Thanks everybody for watching. I've been trying to provide a mix of older comics and newer comics, as well as bigger titles and smaller titles. Let me know in the comments what you think of how I'm doing, and what kind of stuff you would prefer to see me cover. I'll be back next week with another recent indie comic. Hope to see you then, right here, in the Comic Cave.